Good evening. My name is Mike Kristoff, and I am so excited to be here with you tonight reflecting on the topic of leadership. I'd like to start off tonight by sharing a little story. When I was 26, I had just received my first award from the American Institute of Architects titled the Emerging Leader Award. And when you receive an award like that, it tells you two things. First, you are definitely not yet a leader. And two, if you're lucky and play your cards right, you just might someday become one. About a week later, I was at an event where Randall McShepard, the VP of Talent at RPM International, was also receiving an Emerging Leader Award. When he was given the award, he remarked, "You know, yesterday I turned 40. I would have thought by now that I had already arrived at leadership. I guess I'm still emerging." Which brings me to the topic that I'm going to talk about tonight about when will I arrive as a leader? Over the past 3 years in the John Carroll program, we've learned so many important concepts about what it is that drives companies forward. Over the past year, I've had a chance to read some amazing autobiographies about leaders who inspire me, like Warren Buffett, Elon Musk, Steve Jobs, and most recently, Bob Iger. Over the past 6 months, we've had a chance to interview unbelievable CEOs of for-profit and nonprofit companies. All of these experiences have taught me that while all of these topics you see on the screen are critical to the success of a company, none of them mean anything in the absence of good leadership. And when you talk about leadership, there's so many different directions you could go. You could talk about the core values of a leader that matter, like authenticity and teamwork and trust. You could talk about the different leadership styles and when it's most applicable to kind of deploy them. But today, I want to share with you 5 concepts that are really important to me that I hope will set a great foundation for my own leadership journey moving forward. Today, I want to talk about why it's important to, first, always expand your perspective. Second, build meaningful relationships. Third, manage your emotions. Fourth, strive for good judgment. And fifth, enjoy the journey. Let's dive into the first topic. When I graduated with my Master's of Architecture, I moved to Cleveland and started to get civically involved. I started to notice that the city was tackling some really complicated challenges with overly simple and sometimes uninspired solutions, and I wanted to change that. So a friend and I started an international design competition to attract ideas from all over the world to try to help the city tackle some of these challenges. Now, we didn't think any of these ideas were ever going to actually get built. The point of the competition was to try to expand people's perspective on what was possible. And as I think about perspective, there's 3 things I want to keep in mind. First, developing perspective is a lifelong journey. There are no shortcuts to it. And if you wait to develop it till the moment you think you need it, it's probably going to be too late. For me, this manifests by a near obsession watching online lectures and TED videos and listening to podcasts about topics that I love, and sometimes topics I'm just seeing if I have any interest in. It really doesn't matter how you develop your perspective on the world. It only matters that you don't sit in your own bubble. Secondly, no one's perspective is the same. It doesn't matter if you share a single moment in time with another person, because your perspective on that experience is the result of all of the things you've ever experienced in your past, and their past is different. So although you shared that moment, your perspective on it is probably still different. And third, no perspective is ever the complete picture. It doesn't matter how well you think you understand a situation or what a person's going through. There's always something you don't actually understand. The best leaders are confident in the perspective that they bring to the table, but also excited and curious to learn about the perspective of others. I love this graphic because it so easily illustrates how someone can focus on their own struggles and not be able to see the problems facing the other person in their narrative. The second thing I'd like to talk about tonight is why it's so important to build meaningful relationships. I remember sitting at the City Club of Cleveland, listening to Albert Ratner talk about his amazing career here in Cleveland. He finished his talk and a woman raised her hand and said, "Mr. Ratner, Would you mind sharing with the audience a moment in time when you weren't able to solve the problem before you? And he paused for a second and he said, I don't remember ever solving any problems, but I've always known who to call next. His point was that we as individuals don't solve problems. You have to build meaningful relationships with people so that you can collaborate and solve them together. There are so many things about building meaningful relationships that are important, but I want to talk about the three that I want to focus on as I move forward. The first has to do with growth and mentorship. I was interviewing Gregory Peckham, the executive director of Land Studio, and we talked a lot about how leadership responsibilities shift over a person's career. And he gave the example that a chef might spend the first decade of their career learning to become the absolute best cook they can be. But at some point, they might decide they want to own the restaurant, and they see the responsibilities shift. At that point, they need to understand when it's their turn to cook and when it's their time to cook, and when it's time for them to set the table so that others can grow into the best cook they can be. My second point is actually a personal struggle of mine. When you're building relationships and collaborating with people, you need to listen to understand, not to respond. This is difficult for me because I process my own thoughts by talking through them, which means that if I'm not really careful, I might show up to a situation and constantly interrupt someone, or maybe talk so much that other people don't even have a chance to share their perspective. And that's something I really need to work on. Lastly, bringing people together has to do with inclusion. I was interviewing Liz Maugens, the founder of Zygo Press, and one of the most important organizers in the arts community here in Cleveland. And I asked her, I said, Liz, how have you been able to, over your career, so consistently attract followers to the things that you are doing? What is it about your leadership style? And she said, I really don't know how to answer that question. For me, it's always just been about bringing people together. It was so lovely the way she simplified that, because it really is about that, right? It's about building the biggest table you possibly can, seeing which seats are empty, and finding diverse voices to invite to that table. The third topic I want to talk about tonight is one that I have kind of an odd relationship with. I can literally remember my wife hysterically laughing at me as she walked in on me telling my 4-year-old that he needed to manage his emotions and not just react every time that his brother hit him. Not necessarily the best leadership moment, and one could argue that maybe 4 years old is a little too early for the manage your emotions talk, but I really care about this because I really truly believe that if you can't manage your emotions, you're going to end up making emotional mistakes that you wouldn't have otherwise intellectually made. And so as I think about how my emotions show up when I'm leading, there are 3 things I want to keep in mind. First, I have got to keep track of how my emotions are impacting the way I'm showing up. Second, I've got to have empathy towards others. When you're leading, if you don't truly understand, or at least try to understand what people are going through, you're never going to be able to modulate your own emotional tone to be supportive of theirs. And lastly, you've got to be able to compartmentalize. On any given day, a leader might have to collaborate with someone who's having the absolute best day of their life, and then 5 minutes later have to collaborate with someone who's having the absolute worst. If you've had a chance to read Bob Iger's autobiography, in it, he tells the story of a 24-hour period when he had to do 3 things. First, he had to start out his day giving the speech of a lifetime at the opening of Hong Kong Disney. 4 hours later, he had to be on a phone call with his leadership team in Orlando trying to figure out if anyone from the Walt Disney Company had been impacted by the mass shooting at the Pulse nightclub the night before. And 4 hours after that, he had to call the 2 parents of a young 4-year-old boy who had just been attacked and killed by an alligator at one of his resorts. During these conversations, Mr. Iger didn't shy away from his emotions. He poured them into each situation with the emotional tone that was required. Being able to manage your emotions isn't about pretending not to get upset. It's about being aware of the emotions that you have that are present and how they're impacting your actions. My 4th point tonight is a little harder to wrap your head around because it's not something you can just read a book about. good judgment comes from decades of experience. I was interviewing Lillian Curry, the COO of the Cleveland Foundation, in preparation for today, and she made the comment that good judgment is the single thing that separates good leaders from great leaders. So what is it about developing good judgment that I want to keep in mind as I move forward in my career? First, you are never going to have enough time or information to make the perfect decision. Having good judgment comes from days or weeks or sometimes years of experience building up to the moment when you're able to make the right judgment call with whatever time and information you have available to you. Secondly, you have to remain optimistic. When you're in an optimistic frame of mind, you're able to look at problems as things that can be solved for and not hurdles that you can't overcome. It's not about pretending that bad things don't happen, but it is about thinking that your influence can take a bad situation to a better outcome. My last comment on this has to do with a phrase I know we've all used, I know I've used, and it's the little phrase, I had a gut feeling about that. Well, I have news for you. There's no such thing as a gut feeling. A gut feeling is just the result of years of hard work culminating in good judgment. This has never been clearer for me than watching the principals of my own company deal with making complicated decisions over the last year of the global pandemic. There is absolutely nothing any of them could have done to prepare for the decisions they were going to have to make this past year. But it's the culmination of everything they ever did that put them in a position to make good decisions during one of the most complicated times any of us have ever seen. My last point tonight is that as a leader, I want to remember that you have to enjoy the journey. With as complicated and hard as work and life can get, it is so easy to get focused on the wrong things. And so as I think about what this means to me, there are three things that I want to keep in mind. First, you have to aim for excellence. No one has ever enjoyed or been excited about aiming for mediocrity. And the best thing about aiming for excellence is if you don't quite get there, you at least know you gave it everything you had. Second, you have to focus on the journey, not the final destination. In your career, if all you ever focus on is the biggest milestones of that next promotion or that new title or that next raise, you're going to miss so many wonderful moments along the way. My last comment is that you have to treat people really well. If you've ever worked with me on anything, you've probably heard some version of the phrase, work is hard enough. We don't have to make it harder than it is. And for me, this has to do with how we treat one another, how we support one another, and how we help one another grow. This reminds me of a quote by author and speaker on the topic of leadership, Drew Dudley. He was being interviewed by Dr. Scott Allen on his podcast Phronesis. And in response to a question, Dr. Allen said, you know, sometimes it's the little things like a hug from my daughter that make a day great. And Drew interrupted him right there and said, don't you dare do that. Don't you dare call that hug a little thing. But we all do that, don't we? We call the most powerful things we do the little things. How we treat one another isn't a little thing, it's significant. And it's sometimes the only thing that separates whether any of us can enjoy the journey that we're on. So as I reflect on my journey forward, I hope that when I retire, I can look back and say that I always was a lifelong learner and strived to expand my perspective, that I worked hard to build meaningful relationships and help others grow, that I never, or at least rarely, let emotions make decisions for me, that I always remembered that it was hard work that was going to result in good judgment, and lastly, that I enjoyed the journey. So as I reflect on the question that I started with, when will I arrive? It's never been more clear for me that the answer is never. Because you don't ever arrive at leadership. It's not about leadership as a destination. It's about leadership as a journey. Thank you.
Thank you, Michael. How about any questions we have for Michael as he transitions his recording?